What is going on, guys? It's Modded Dwarf here. Welcome back to another PS5 jailbreak news update, as well as some PS4 news. So in this video, I'm going to be covering the progress that has been made so far in getting the PS5 kernel exploit up and running that I covered in my previous video. I'll leave a link to it down in the description and in the cards in the top right hand corner. Also with PS4, we have a new beta build of Gold HEN, so we'll be taking a look at that as well. So firstly, let's dive into the PS5 news, because I do want to clear up some confusion regarding some of the updates here. Okay, so starting off with the PS5 news first of all. So of course, in my last video, I covered this new kernel exploit for the PS5. That's actually an older kernel exploit that was patched on the PS4 years ago. It was the same kernel exploit that gave us the 6.72 and 7.02 jailbreaks for the PS4. However, it was never patched in the PS5 up until now. So now we have this new kernel exploit that is being worked on here on the PS5 to try and get, a more substantial exploit. So since that news came out that this was disclosed on HackerOne, we did actually get a second disclosure not long after it, again from the flow, this time for this other exploit, another kernel exploit, the exFAT. exFAT leads to memory corruption via malformed USB drives. So this actually isn't new. There were quite a few people thinking this was another new kernel exploit that we've got. Unfortunately not. This is known about for a long time. In fact, this is the same kernel exploit that we currently use to jailbreak the PS4 on 9.00. It's just only been disclosed now. So obviously the Flow himself obviously figured this out first and reported it to Sony, got the $10,000 bounty, but then at that point he wasn't allowed to disclose it until now. However, between the time that he initially reported this and the time that it actually got disclosed on September 21st, other hackers in the scene figured it out as well. And that was, of course, ChendoChap, with help from, of course, Spectre and also Nullpointer and Luri. So this was already discovered way back in December of last year, and that was the big 9.00 jailbreak for the PS4. So unfortunately, this is not a new kernel exploit. This is something, again, we've known about for a long time, and that's been implemented on the PS4 a long time ago. So nothing new there, really. The big one we're talking about, of course, is this use after free in IPv6. This is the one that was not known about. So in terms of what firmware this was patched on, I still haven't got any concrete confirmation. In my last video, I said it was maybe around 5.00. However, it looks like it's probably going to be 5.02, maybe 5.01, mainly because this was marked as resolved on April 14th, which just happened to be the same exact day that the 5.02 firmware update for the PS5 came out. So it's likely that 5.02 was the firmware that patched this exploit. So as long as you're lower than 5.02, your console should be vulnerable. However, again, that's not been confirmed yet. Of course, it could also be 5.01 because sometimes it usually takes them a few days after they release the firmware update before they mark the HackerOne report as resolved. So it's usually, a few days to a week. So it could be April 7th or a little bit before then that it was actually patched. So that could be 5.01. So 5.01 or 5.02 are likely the firmwares that patch this vulnerability. But I still maintain that you need to have a PS5 that's on a firmware lower than 5.00 in order to take advantage of this kernel exploit. And that is because in order to actually use this kernel exploit, it has to be paired with a userland exploit as well. You need a userland exploit plus the kernel exploit. And right now, the only usable userland exploit that we have is, of course, the BDJ exploit with the Blu-ray disc, which is also from the Flow. So this was patched on 5.00, so you need to have a console that's on a lower firmware than 5.0 in order to be able to successfully utilize this kernel exploit in combination with the BDJ userland exploit. So 4.51 and 4.50, those firmwares should be absolutely fine because you can use the BDJ exploit, and this kernel exploit shouldn't be patched on those firmwares either. So that should work right there. Although I still highly recommend that the best firmware to be on right now is 4.03, because 4.03 is vulnerable to multiple exploits. It's vulnerable to the BDJ exploit, the userland exploit. It's vulnerable to this new kernel exploit. It's also vulnerable to the old exFAT hack kernel exploit that we're using in 9.00 on the PS4. The PS5 is vulnerable to that one too. And it's also vulnerable to a WebKit exploit as well. So there's 4 different exploits there that 4.03 and lower firmwares are vulnerable to, whereas if you update to say 4.50, then that patches the WebKit exploit, and that patches one of the kernel exploits, the exFAT hack one. So then you only have 2 exploits to work with. So it's better to keep your PS5 on as low a firmware as possible right now until an exploit, a usable exploit, actually comes out. Then you can update to it, because the lower firmware your PS5's on, the more exploits it's vulnerable to and the more options you have for exploiting the console in future. So definitely recommend just staying on as low firmware as possible right now at this stage. So those are my recommendations right there, is to stay on as low a firmware as possible. So let's take a look at some of the advancements that have been made in getting this kernel exploit implemented on the PS5. So firstly, we had John Tornblum, who came out a couple of days ago and put out a implementation of this kernel exploit for FreeBSD12, which is kind of like the underlying operating system that the PS5 is based on. So what these hackers typically will do is that they will test the kernel exploit in a virtual machine that's running FreeBSD12 for the PS5 or FreeBSD9 for the PS4, and they'll try and implement the kernel exploit on that, because it's a much easier testing environment to test a kernel exploit with, because if it fails, you can just restart the virtual machine and load the exploit. You don't have to access it through a userland exploit or anything like that. So it's a much better testing environment to prove the kernel exploit out, make sure it's working properly, make sure that they can trigger it consistently. And then once they've actually got a good implementation of that kernel exploit working in FreeBSD, they will then move on to implement it on the PS5 itself through the userland exploit, which is what Slayers Gorvy has managed to do. So he is currently working on an actual implementation for the PS5 itself, as you can see here, committed 2 days ago. And we have a work in progress kernel exploit being implemented here on the PS5 itself, which will obviously be combined with the BDJ exploit, the Blu-ray drive disc exploit. However, if you are on a digital edition console, again, I would recommend staying on 4.03, because you do have that WebKit exploit that could maybe be chained with this at some point. Although, of course, WebKit exploits, there's a lot of security layers that are added on here to the WebKit on the PS5, which make it much more difficult to use the WebKit, to use an actual WebKit exploit to trigger a kernel exploit. So I'm not sure if that'll ever happen, but it's better to have the option there, especially if you're on a digital console and you don't have the option to use the BDJ, the Blu-ray drive exploit instead. So definitely stay on 4.03 or lower for now, especially if you're on a digital edition console. But yeah, those are the updates we have there. We've got a FreeBSD12 implementation from John Tornblum, and we have a work in progress implementation on the PS5 itself by Slayers Gorvy. So the last note to end on here with the PS5 stuff is not to get your hopes up for a full jailbreak. I did cover this in my previous video, and I've seen other devs come out now and also reiterate this, which is that, of course, this is not a full jailbreak. If it was a PS4, it would be a full jailbreak. You just need the userland and the kernel exploit, and you have a full jailbreak. But unfortunately, the PS5 has extra security layers like the hypervisor, which is like a virtualization layer that everything runs on. And of course, it restricts access, so it stops the kernel from being patched. So you can't patch the kernel like you could in the PS4, because the hypervisor prevents that. And then you also have execute-only memory as well, which makes it hard to access the memory of the system. So of course, it's much more restricted. So even with a userland and a kernel exploit, it's still very limited. The devs at the moment are saying this is mainly for developers, this exploit, so that developers can get a better understanding of the system to maybe exploit it further in future. However, it's not really going to be useful to end users. I think there may be some things that could potentially be done with this. Maybe access to the file system to swap out files on the hard drive, possibly some form of basic homebrew in future. Obviously nothing like piracy, nothing like being able to run actual PS5 or PS4 games on the system. That's not possible without a hypervisor exploit, I believe. And of course, enabling the debug settings should be possible, since the Flow seemed to be able to do it without a hypervisor exploit. So that's pretty much all I have here so far for the PS5 jailbreak updates. Let's move over to the PS4 and take a look at the new version of Gold HEN. Again, this is a beta version 2.2.5B2. So you can access this new version of Gold HEN by opening up the internet browser and heading to kmeps4.site, which is Chameleon's host. So if you head there, we can go to Chameleon 9.00 AIO and then the Gold HEN collection. And then from here, you can see that we have version 2.2.5B2 beta, and you can run that to load the payload. Now, of course, I'm going to be using my Raspberry Pi host instead, which has the latest version of Gold HEN on there. I've done a video not long ago showing you guys how to update Gold HEN on whatever, chip you're using, like your ESP32s, your ESP8266s, your ESP32 S2 and S3 chips like the Feather S2 or Tiny S2, or the Raspberry Pi chips like the Raspberry Pi 0W, 02W, and 4B. So if you're using any of those chips to auto-load Gold HEN, then you can go ahead and check out that video on how to update it so that you can put this new version of Gold HEN on there if you want to use it with those chips. So of course, I'll have that video linked in the cards and in the description as well. But anyway, I'm running it here. So if we head into Gold HEN, you can see the main difference in this particular version is that we now have the game overlay section. So in here, there is an FPS counter. So you've got this enable FPS counter. So if you enable this, this will only work when you're not running a game. So if you enable this while you're running a game, you'll have to restart it. However, once it's enabled, you can then toggle the FPS counter on and off even when a game is running. So what we'll do is we'll hop into a game here. So you see what game I've got that I can actually run. Probably Black Ops 3, I guess. Okay, so here we are on Black Ops 3. So what I'm going to do is just hit the middle button. You can see there's no FPS counter showing up right now. But then if we head back into the Gold HEN settings and then go to game overlay, we can now show FPS counter and toggle that on. And if we go back into the game, you can see in the top left-hand corner, we do indeed have an FPS counter. Okay, so I've loaded up a game here on Shadows of Evil on Black Ops 3. You can see the FPS counter there in the top left. I'm also going to use a tool to draw the in-game FPS counter up here as well. So this is the one that's been drawn here from the actual game itself, which may be a little bit more accurate. Although it just seems to be solid 60 FPS the whole time, so I'm not entirely sure how accurate either of these FPS counters are, because Gold HEN's one does seem to be kind of dropping when I kind of feel a change in the frame rate slightly, whereas the one on the right is just 60 all the time, which doesn't seem quite correct. But then the Gold HEN one doesn't seem perfectly correct either, because you'll notice that sometimes it goes above 60, whereas I believe this game is supposed to be locked to 60, but the counter is going above 60 at times. Sometimes it even jumps up to like 70 FPS or higher, which is very unlikely because, yeah, this should be VSync to 60. So, yeah, again, there may be some inaccuracies in both FPS counters here. But, yeah, I mean, this is a beta version of the payload, so I'm sure it can be improved in future. But as you can see there, it's still fairly accurate for the most part, it seems. So, yeah, there you go, guys. We've got an in-game FPS counter added to Gold HEN. This is currently in the beta version that you do have to, donate to Sistro if you want to get access to. Although, you never know. Somebody will probably put it in an exploit host. But it really shouldn't be at this stage because it is a beta version. But again, once a full version of Gold HEN releases, you'll be able to access this for free. So anyway, that's what we've got here for the PS4, a updated version of Gold HEN, a beta build that adds a FPS counter. And of course, we've got the PS5 updates, the work on getting a kernel exploit implemented. We have a work in progress kernel exploit from Slayer's Gorvy that is currently being implemented on the PS5, and we'll have to see where that goes. Once we get more information on that, or once we get a full implementation, I will of course update you guys with another video. So hope you guys enjoyed this one or found the information useful. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe, and I'll hopefully see you guys in the next one.